Thank you for being with us today. Thank you so much. I appreciate. And Scott, let's start with the national security strategy of the United States 2022, in which the system of governance is divided into democracies and autocracies. I wanted to know, is it all about democracy or what Eisenhower called as military industrial complex?
Well, it's definitely not about democracy, at least in the conventional sense. What the Biden administration is selling isn't democracy, it's American dominance. It's a system where the United States gets to, under the guise of setting a strong moral and ethical, standard that others should seek to adhere to, is instead imposing its will on the rest of the world. And anybody who is in opposition to this American imposed hegemony is deemed to be autocratic because, of course, if you're democratic, you'd love the American way. But the American way isn't democratic. There's nothing democratic about the United States anymore. Just being straight up honest. Yeah, we go to polls and we vote, but we vote for one of two political parties that aren't democratic at all. There is no democracy when it comes to the Democratic and Republican party structure. It's a system of political and economic elites that make their own rules and select their own candidates for inclusion in a ballot where the American people are presented with a predefined decision. We don't get to select who's president. The nominees for president are selected by others, not us. So it's not a democracy, and it's failing across the board to meet the needs of the people. It meets, of course, the needs of corporate America, thanks to Citizens United. Now corporate America is deemed to be a citizen online with actual citizens, and they have the money necessary to influence politics far beyond anything the average American could ever hope or aspire to. So we don't have a democracy in America. We have at best a plutocracy, and this is what we're trying to impose on the world. And we are against nations that do have viable democratic institutions, like Russia. We call them autocrats, but they're not autocrats. They're Democrats. They actually are responsive to the needs and wants and will of the people in a way that America isn't. So the national security strategy is about sustaining this system, this rules-based international order. Notice I didn't say law-based international order. I said rules-based international order, rules that have been foisted on the world ever since the end of the Second World War, where the United States emerged as the most powerful nation in the world, economically, militarily, and politically. So there you are. It has nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with autocracy, everything to do with continuance of American global domination.
And what's the role of military-industrial complex in the whole situation? How do you see
Well,
that?
I mean, the military-industrial complex plays a very important role in influencing defense policy and, by extension, foreign policy. They have allowed the perceived need to create the current military establishment to become a vehicle for dominating Congress, preventing Congress from deviating off course. It's the military-industrial establishment is the root of what people would call the deep state in the United States. It is a permanent, non-elected body that exerts extraordinarily influence on the elected body. In fact, in many instances, you can't be elected unless this non-elected body supports you. Hence, I go back to the Republican and Democratic parties not being democratic in nature. It's not what the people want. It's what the big companies want. Not just the military companies, but, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, anytime you have billions of dollars at stake, they're there. But the defense industry is directly linked to Congress because Congress has worked with these defense leaders to spread the wealth, so to speak. We're talking about budgets that are so big that they are literally game changers in local politics, given the fact that they imply jobs, with a good tax base, et cetera. The American dream, people who have these jobs can, of course, buy their house with the 2 garages and all this sort of thing, at least for the moment. So whenever someone says, well, wait a minute, we need to rein in defense spending, you can't, because the economy, the way it's constructed, depends on this money. If you cut defense spending, you're cutting jobs, you're cutting factories, you're cutting the tax base. So they're so closely intertwined, as to be one and the same. And so, yes, the defense industry plays a heavy role on continuing defense spending at the levels they are and increasing them. And normally you can't justify this kind of defense spending unless you have a posture on how you interact with the rest of the world that justifies this level of expenditure, which is why the National Security Strategy document is so critical, because that defines how America is going to interface with the world going forward. And given the fact that it's linked to this defense budget, it means our interfacing will be very aggressive with a high probability of military conflict.
And let's get to the Ukraine war. Why the Ukrainians decided to bomb Poland? What was their ultimate goal in
Well, we
Poland?
won't know until we actually, until somebody takes into custody the people who made that decision. I personally believe that the decision was made at a lower level by an ultra-nationalist who fired a Ukrainian surface-to-air missile into Polish territory for the express purpose of creating a crisis, and they got what they wanted. Everybody is focused on the initial, outcries from Poland and the Baltic states and the Czech Republic, blaming it on Russia and asking for an Article 4, to convene Article 4 discussions on possibly creating a no-fly zone. There was no Article 4 discussion. The adults in NATO said, no, we know what happened here. And there won't be a no-fly zone now. But look what they got. Look what they accomplished. Germany is deploying 2 Patriot surface-to-air missile batteries to the Ukrainian border. Previously, NATO didn't want to put air defense units that far forward because the air defense umbrella would extend into Ukrainian territory. And that could lead to the potential of force-on-force conflict. But now they're doing it. Why? Because Ukraine attacked Poland, not Russia. Ukraine attacked Poland, and Germany's responding in a way as if Russia attacked Poland by extending NATO air defense into Western Ukraine. Germany's also bringing fighter aircraft to fly combat air patrols over Polish territory. Again, not because Russia threatened Poland, but because Ukraine attacked Poland. They are positioning the pieces necessary for a very rapid implementation of a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. And ask yourself why this is happening and why would Ukrainian nationalists do this? We have to understand the reality is Ukraine is losing this war and will lose this war. Everybody knows this. The politicians want to pretend otherwise, but anybody with any military common sense understands that the military math is the algorithm is such that Ukraine cannot win this conflict. They are burning through their resources, a burn rate much higher than their replenishment rate. Meanwhile, Russia is about to receive 10 to 15 division equivalents of troops next month, trained, equipped, ready to fight. And that's a game-changing event. And it'll begin a process of degradation of Ukrainian military capability up to and including the destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. So the only way to stop this, because there's not enough money to stop this, there's not enough time, there's not enough equipment, there's not enough manpower, is to, from Ukraine's perspective, you have to have NATO intervene. And so they put in pieces a system that could lead to the establishment of a no-fly zone. And now the big problem is what happens when millions of Ukrainian refugees show up on the border of Poland demanding entry because they're freezing to death, because they're hungry, because they have no power, they have no gas, they have no hope. Poland isn't going to let them in. Europe can't absorb them. Europe has its own economic problems. So there will be a growing demand for the creation of a humanitarian corridor where the Western powers can go into Ukraine and provide the shelter, the food, the medical care for these refugees. But those refugees will insist that they need to be protected from a Russian threat. So then they'll implement a no-fly zone. That's the direction we're heading. And it's a very dangerous situation because I don't know how Russia would respond to that.
Does Poland have air defense system or no?
Yes, they do.
What it didn't work?
Well, first of all, air defense isn't perfect, meaning you don't always shoot down what you're looking at. Second of all, their air defense has suffered, like the rest of NATO, from a lack of attention. Just because Russia, moved into Ukraine in February doesn't mean that Poland solves all of its problems ever since. Poland has put a lot of its money into its ground forces, supplying material to Ukraine, and they haven't paid as much attention to air defense as necessary. They don't have modern air defenses. That's just why Germany is being called upon to deploy the Patriot missile to the Ukrainian border.
And Scott, we have the Sunak of Britain and Trudeau calling Zelensky after killing 2 Poles and calling him as a friend, and how hypocrisy can get thick and thicker in this battle, in this war. They were talking about the barbarity of Russians while Ukrainian bombed Poland and killed two people. How? I don't understand this.
I mean, what is there to understand? We have politicians living in a fantasy world. The bottom line is, though, that all military professionals understand what's about to happen in Ukraine. And politicians' job is to help Ukraine navigate their own domestic political obstacles toward a negotiated settlement. But Ukraine has put unrealistic terms out there. Putin has to leave. That ain't going to happen. The Russians have to evacuate the 4 territories that are now part of Russia. That's not going to happen. Russia has to give up Crimea. That's not going to happen either. And Russia has to turn over, Russia has to pay reparations. Don't think so. And Russia has to turn over its military and civilian leadership to Ukraine to be prosecuted as war criminals. I mean, this is just fantasy. And Russia's not even going to play this game. Russia, I believe, you'll see starting next month, is going to initiate actions that will lead to the termination of this conflict on terms that will be dictated by Russia and nobody else.
And we know that 40,000 troops, American troops, in Poland, what they're doing there, are they training the soldiers? I don't know. What they're doing there.
Well, they're there as a deterrence against. I mean, they're there to deter a Russian invasion of Poland, but Russia has no intention of invading Poland. But they're there to make a presence, to make the Polish feel like they're being defended and protected. They're not a serious combat force. Anybody who thinks that these 40,000 would be useful in a war against Russia doesn't understand what war is and what's needed to fight a war, and et cetera. There's no sustainability factor there. There's no real combat power there. It's literally a political force. It's a force of deterrence, a tripwire against an event that will never happen. Russia will not be invading Poland.
Can Russia block the lines of providing weapons to Ukraine? If so, what they're not doing this?
First of all, it's a huge border, so it's a difficult target to begin with. Second of all, to do so would require a level of destruction that Russia has said it didn't want to engage in, permanent disabling of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. Third, it would require an escalation of violence near the border of NATO countries, increasing the likelihood of spillover, which Russia doesn't want. Russia has made a hard decision that they're better off interdicting and destroying this equipment once it reaches the battlefield than trying to get it at the border. And so far, Russia, yes, they've paid a price. Yes, there are systems in play, but Russia's winning this conflict. So from a strategic standpoint, the Russian decision is a proper decision. Russia must ensure that it does not do anything that gives NATO an excuse to intervene. And interdicting arms shipments at the border could create the conditions where NATO was compelled to intervene. So Russia's giving them the border and seeking to interdict this material once it comes across. But the United States has deployed a lot of resources that are committed to getting the stuff from the border to the Ukrainian armed forces, and some of the best and the brightest in the American military establishment are involved in coming up with ways to avoid Russian interdiction. So it's a deadly game of cat and mouse taking place. Sometimes the Russians are able to bomb a warehouse, sometimes they're not. But once the stuff comes to the battlefield, Russia destroys it.
And we have Der Spiegel from Germany reported that high-tech German artillery guns are failing. Just yesterday it came out that they're failing, and Germany cannot afford to enough spare parts to keep the cannons working. How ridiculous is that? If Germany is like this, how they gonna fight anything?
Well, understand that Germany has, when it absorbs a weapon system, it has a system that's designed to maintain the equipment and operate it within the German system. The problem is they've sent this advanced equipment over to Ukraine where there's insufficient maintenance. And I think what Germany's saying is that if they give the spare parts to Ukraine, they won't have any spare parts for their guns if they go to war. So, and it's the same thing with the American M777. It has a high failure rate, especially if it's operated with the level of intensity that the Ukrainians are using their artillery. It's going to fail, and there are insufficient spare parts. You don't provide the Ukrainians with advanced Western equipment. It's not a smart move. It's a self-destructive move. It looks good politically. It plays well initially on the battlefield, but in the long term, the old Soviet-era artillery pieces are what you want because they work all the time, every time. You can have them rusty. You can cover them in mud. You can kick them. You can drop them. You can do anything you want with them, and yet when you pull the lanyard, they fire. Not so the Caesar, the French artillery, or the German artillery, or the American artillery. These are high-tech, complicated pieces of equipment that really didn't factor in the reality of continuous large-scale ground combat in Europe when they were designed.
And we had Lloyd Austin on Saturday at the Halifax International Security Forum. He made a pretty amazing statement. In this statement, in the first part, he says that Russians have a massive military and impressive weapons, which debunks all the analysis by Petraeus since the war started. All along the war, it debunks all of the analysis of Petraeus. How do you see this statement from?
Well, remember, Petraeus is no longer on active service. Petraeus' job right now is to appease his masters, and his masters are corporate media. So his job is to create perception amongst the American public. To the extent that he has connectivity with the establishment, it's only to release information that's been cleared by the establishment to be released to the American people through the vehicle of David Petraeus to provide more credibility. But there's nothing credible about anything David Petraeus says about Ukraine. He's been wrong across the board. In Lloyd Austin's initial statement in Halifax underscores that the reality is people who know what's going on understand that Russia has tremendous military capability.
And in the latter part of his statements, he says that considering all those weapons, Russian couldn't prevail. How do you see this part of his statement?
Well, his job is to support the Biden administration's policy. So he cannot be seen as saying anything that undermines that policy. One would think that his job would be to provide accurate information to the president about military affairs, but that's not his job. That's the job of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who recently said, we need to be looking for a negotiated off-ramp here because Mark Milley knows that we can't win, that the West can't win. But Lloyd Austin can't say that. He's a political appointee. He's not an elected official. It's not his career job, even though he came from a career military background. His job is to sustain the policies of the Biden administration. And remember, the Biden administration is getting ready to ask a lame duck session of Congress for around $40 billion more assistance to Ukraine. So if Lloyd Austin got up and said, and we can't win, that means why are we sending more money? Lloyd Austin has to say something that justifies the amount of weaponry that the United States is preparing to send to Ukraine.
And the other day he had an interview with CNN. He said that the reporter asked him, how do you see Shoigu? Are you talking to him? How you're communicating? He said, I know that Shoigu he's not the one who decides about everything. He just gets order. And I was thinking, like, what are you doing, Lloyd Austin? Yeah.
Well, let's remember this. Lloyd Austin has been Secretary of Defense for 2 years. Shoigu has been Putin's close personal friend for 22 years. Now, you tell me, who do you think has more influence on whom? Do you think Shoigu, a close personal friend of Vladimir Putin, who has been with him from the very beginning of his presidency, was instrumental in helping Putin not just become president, but remain as president? And Lloyd Austin, this fly-by-night nobody, picked out for political reasons, who doesn't have a close personal relationship with Biden, and in any case, in 2 years will be history. You tell me who is more influential. It ain't Lloyd Austin. Okay, Lloyd Austin lives in an American bubble of fantasy where he believes he's important. He believes he's doing this. At the end of the day, Biden will do what Biden does because Biden didn't need Lloyd Austin for Biden to be where he is today. Vladimir Putin understands that, the role that Shoigu has played over the years in supporting him. Shoigu is loyal. Shoigu can be trusted. And so when a trusted, loyal friend/servant, because remember, they go on vacations with each other. When was the last time Joe Biden went on vacation with Lloyd Austin? When was the last time they went fishing, together, camping, etc.? No. So Austin lives in a fantasy world. He's impressed with his own importance, and he's being dismissive of something he doesn't understand. He doesn't know Shoigu. Just because you had a phone conversation with Shoigu doesn't mean you know Shoigu. I'm not saying Shoigu's perfect. Of course, he's made mistakes just like everybody else. I'm saying that the relationship between Shoigu and Putin is such that Putin will listen to Shoigu every time he picks up the phone. Whereas the relationship between Austin and Biden is such that Austin may not call the president because he's concerned that the phone won't be answered.
How serious is the situation of energy in Ukraine? We know that they cannot provide civilians with energy. How they can keep the war going?
Well, the war can be fought because troops are able to dig in, build a bunker, build a small fire, stay warm. Um, Civilians, on the other hand, in an apartment building that has no heat or energy or light, just freeze to death. And this is problematic for Ukraine. This is a huge crisis, and I think when you combine the reality that Ukrainians are in a untenable situation in terms of energy, that a significant percentage of their civilian population is going to be put at risk, to include risk of death because of the situation, and you combine that with Russia's impending reinforcement by 220,000 troops, it all just adds up to a situation where Ukraine will not be able to continue to fight this war.
And how we know that yesterday Ukrainian again are shelling Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. How I don't know. I don't know why the Western allies of Ukraine are not telling them what they have. There has to be some limits to their actions.
Well, it's just the opposite. The Western allies are telling the Ukrainians to shell it, keep shelling it, don't stop shelling it, create this sense of emergency so that the International Atomic Energy Agency can negotiate the demilitarization of the plant and taking over the plant, taking it out of Russian control and turning it over to Ukrainian control. That's the goal right now. So the West will never condemn this. The West will always support it. They're implicitly telling the Ukrainians to keep shelling it because they're not telling the Ukrainians to stop. So by not telling the Ukrainians to stop, you're basically saying keep on doing it. Meanwhile, they're pressing the IAEA to go forward and make the case for the internationalization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, with an eye to, once that occurs, to turn it over to Ukrainian government control.
And the Financial Times reported that there are rumors that I don't know if there are tensions between the top military commander of Ukraine and between him and Zelensky. How is there a gap started to develop in between them?
Well, there's always been a gap. The military is not happy with Zelensky, and Zelensky's not happy with the military. The military knows the reality is they cannot continue this fight without the tens of billions of dollars of assistance provided by NATO and the United States and others, and that the person that's responsible for getting this assistance is Zelensky. Zelensky has been turned into this propaganda machine. He's the new Winston Churchill, King Leonidas, etc. And so the military has to tolerate Zelensky, and Zelensky therefore has leveraged the influence he has over the West into the ability to dictate courses of action to the military, insisting that the military conduct offenses that serve very little military purpose but have political value that Zelensky believes he needs to go to the West for more money. But now we've reached the situation where there isn't enough money in the world to save Ukraine. So Zelensky's value is diminishing, and you see that his lies to the West about the missile. People are already, saying
He knew that. He knew that.
It doesn't matter what he knew; it matters what he said. He's the commander in chief. He's the president. You don't open your mouth until you know all the facts. You don't commit to a narrative until you know all the facts. He committed to a narrative that's wrong, and he's doubled down, and he's embarrassed himself, and the military is embarrassed for him. You see in the West, the general has a high profile now. Everybody's talking about him, about how good of a general he is, a good military commander, he's a good leader. And Zelensky is being called a fool, a buffoon, or people just stop talking about him. So the general star is rising. Zelensky's star is dimming.
And we have ex-Japanese Prime Minister saying that Zelensky is making Ukrainians suffer. I I wonder why he's doing this to Ukraine and Ukrainians. It seems that he's ready to risk the entire world in this war.
Well, remember, he is a comedian who was put in power by an oligarch to do the bidding of the oligarch and had found himself leading a nation at war, and he's totally unqualified to do so. He is a product not of his resume and his accomplishments. He's a product of a script that has been written for him by others. So if you're saying that Zelensky is, wants his country to be destroyed, no, Zelensky's simply doing that which other nations have told him to do under the notion that Ukraine can somehow be saved. But Ukraine can't be saved because nobody was ever interested in saving Ukraine. They were only interested in harming Russia. And so the West was willing to sacrifice everything to achieve the objective of harming Russia. And because Zelensky was a compliant tool of the West, his policies have ultimately end up doing extraordinary harm to Ukraine.
And how do you see the midterm elections in the United States? The other day I was talking to Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He was hoping, it was before the election, he was hoping that this change, if Republicans wins, at that time he was talking about this. If Republicans win, we may see the change in the U.S. policy. How do you see this? He's gonna Pelosi. We know that Nancy Pelosi is stepping down, but is it going to change the U.S. policy on Ukraine?
Ultimately, probably not in terms of the policy, which is to back Ukraine, oppose Russia, etc. But the amount of money that's provided Ukraine may, in fact, change, especially if people like Margaret Taylor Greene are able to ask questions and demand answers of the military that the current Democrats were unwilling to do so. When it becomes clear that we've provided Ukraine with tens of billions of dollars that nobody can account for, we don't know where it went, we don't know how it was used, we don't know if it was used to support terrorists in Europe, etc. That creates a political momentum of its own, and there's no telling what that will lead to. Whether the appointment of an inspector general, because Americans want to continue to supply Ukraine with tens of billions of dollars, but this time they want it to be accounted for, or the reduction of aid until which time Ukraine can, tell us how it was used, or a withdrawal from Ukraine. We don't know what the spinoff is. Initially, the Republicans appear to be inclined to continue to support a war against Russia because the Republicans are as deeply infected with the Russophobic disease as their Democratic counterparts are. They hate Russia. So it's not about stopping a war because the Republicans think that the Russians are okay and they can do business with them. It's about stopping the funding of a war because the American taxpayer is furious that money is being sent to Ukraine but not spent on their needs at home.
And Scott, for the final, can you talk about your book? I see your book behind you, and it's about a template for peacemaking. Could you talk about your book for our audience?
You mean this book here?
Yes.
Disarmament,
exactly.
Perestroika,
yeah.
Arms Control, and the End of the Soviet Union. Sure. I think, I was one of the inspectors that was involved in this treaty. This is a treaty that was signed in 1987, implemented in 1988 to get rid of an entire class of nuclear weapons that was threatening Europe with imminent destruction. Intermediate range missiles, the SS-20 missile on the Russian side, the Pershing II, and the ground-launched cruise missile on the American side. There were other missiles involved. Those are the big players. My job was to go to the factory that produced the SS-20 missile and monitor it to make sure they weren't producing them because the SS-20 missile was banned. And the story of how myself and a small number of American inspectors working together with their Soviet counterparts were able to build from nothing this very complex monitoring system with all the political problems that are going on back and forth is one of the untold successes of the Cold War. People have heard about the INF Treaty, and they know that there are weapons inspectors involved, but they don't know anything beyond that. This gets into the nuts and bolts and shows just how hard this job was and how close to failure we came on several occasions, how much opposition there was to this treaty, both in the United States and the Soviet Union, and how that opposition almost tripped up the inspectors and caused the treaty to fail. We overcame all of this. It also is a very interesting piece of Soviet history because I talk about arms control in the end of the Soviet Union. There's a direct relationship between arms control, perestroika, and the conditions that brought down the Soviet Union. And we inspectors were right there in the middle of it, in one of the most important places in the Soviet Union when it came to the confluence of arms control and perestroika. The Vodkinsk missile factory, the Vodkinsk Production Association, made its money by building missiles. And it's a factory town, just like all the other defense cities around Russia. The money comes in from, to build these weapons, and that money gets parsed out to make schools, to pave roads, to build buildings, to make the standard of living what it was in the town. And when you eliminate missiles like the SS-20, the SS-12, which is a Vodkinsk missile, the SS-23, which is a Vodkinsk missile, 3 missiles were eliminated, which means they weren't building missiles anymore, and they weren't making money. All they had left was 2 missiles that they continued to produce, and there was being pressure put on them by the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty to get rid of those missiles. And then you have Gorbachev, so you have a reduction of money right off the bat. Then you have Gorbachev trying to change the economic structure together with the political structure. One of the interesting things is I was there at the first election run in the Soviet Union. I mean, I watched it. We watched the candidates debate. We read their proposals, and then I attended the actual polling place and was able to see democracy in action. And it was an amazing thing. We watched the Soviet press transition into being a mouthpiece of the Communist Party into truly investigative journalism where they're asking hard questions, demanding answers, and publishing all right there in a newspaper that we wouldn't have known any of this if we weren't living there. You were able to read everything, meet the people, see it. So we saw what was going on with perestroika, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we knew the confluence between that and what we were doing. And it made this fantastic story that couldn't be told because as long as the INF Treaty was in place, inspectors are prohibited from discussing what occurred, what happened. But in 2019, Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the INF Treaty, and then the Russians followed after that. And suddenly I could tell the story. So I spent 3 years writing this book. I made use of an archive that has never been used by anybody ever before, the archive of the inspectors. And I tell a very intimate story, but a thorough history that I tried to make as entertaining and informative as possible. Now people say, okay, but that's history, Scott, history. I mean, really, I'm going to fall asleep listening to history. I say, yes, but if you're listening to this broadcast, that means you're concerned about Ukraine. That means you're concerned about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and the United States. And you're probably thinking, how do we get out of this mess? How do we get off this? See, the history of the INF Treaty is not just a history, but it's a template. It's a roadmap because the 1980s were worse than the current situation. Trust me. I was alive back then. I know. And we almost went to nuclear war several times. The potential for confrontation was much greater. We called them the evil empire. They called us enemy number one. Very dangerous situation. And yet we were able, through the INF Treaty, through the vehicle of arms control, to create a mechanism where, with cooperation, we work together to achieve peace and stability. We did it once. We can do it again. And people say, how? I say, read my book. See what we did. See how difficult it was, but it is possible. It is a beacon of hope, a template that people don't have to be in despair, because it shows that if the United States and Russia are willing and able to work together to accomplish meaningful disarmament, that can lead to the de-escalation of the current tension, and hopefully the ability of our two nations to live, to peacefully coexist. So it's not just a great history, but it's a template of victory in terms of how to peacefully resolve the current crisis.
Thank you for this, Scott. I appreciate your work, the work you're doing for all the humanity. I see every time you are doing the interview with all the people like me, just ordinary people all around the world, to spread the truth, nothing but the truth. And uh, we have to thank you, all of us, because you're doing great job. And nowadays it's really hard to get to the core of these issues by not understanding the real truth behind everything, and you are trying to make everything more understandable for us. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me.
See you later.